She stood at the altar in her finest dress, every seam let out as far as the fabric would allow, and read the note he had left where his hand should have been. The church was full, every pew, every eye. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Martha Bell Crowley had ever heard in her life. But here is what no one in that town expected. She did not cry. She did not beg. She folded that note with steady hands, tucked it into her bodice, and walked back down the aisle, alone, her head, level her stride, unhurried. Something in her had broken, but something else, something harder and quieter, and more durable than any of them knew, had just begun to wake up. Drop your city in the comments and stay with Martha until the very end. This story belongs to every woman who was ever told she was too much. The note was written in pencil. That detail stayed with her longer than the words themselves. Not ink, pencil. As though Hale Dutton had not been fully committed, even to the act of leaving her, as though some part of him had wanted to be able to erase what he had done and pretend it had never happened. She had read it 3 times in the vestibule of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, while the organ played softly on the other side of the door, and 47 people sat in the pews waiting for a bride who would not be coming down the aisle on anyone's arm. I would rather die alone than be embarrassed standing next to you in front of everyone. That was all. No apology. No explanation beyond the one she was already supposed to understand. She was supposed to already know what she was and why she could not be wanted. Martha was 29 years old, and she had spent every one of those years inside a body that the world had decided to treat as an apology. She was large in the way that the frontier was large, broad-shouldered, and solid-framed, built for endurance rather than adornment. Her neck was thick. Her hands were wide. Her face was full and round and unashamed in its plainness. She had never pretended otherwise. She had sewn her own wedding dress because no shop in Caldwell carried anything in her size that did not look like a tent being pressed into ceremonial service. She had spent 11 evenings on that dress. She had done the lacework herself, by lamplight, her thick fingers moving with a precision that would have surprised anyone who had only ever looked at their size. She folded the note, tucked it away, pushed open the door. She walked back down the aisle at the same measured pace at which she had walked in, and every face she passed told her a different version of the same story. Pity from the women who had always suspected Hale was not steady. Vindication from the women who had always suspected Martha was not enough. Relief from no one. Shame from everyone, including people who had no cause to feel it except that they were witnessing something that reminded them of their own private humiliations, the ones they had managed to survive without an audience. She did not cry until she was 3 miles outside of town, alone on the road with her small traveling trunk, which she had packed the night before out of a superstition she could not name. Some part of her had known. She wept then briefly and completely, sitting on the trunk in the tall grass with the wind pulling at her hair and the whole flat Kansas sky pressing down on her. She allowed herself that. 15 minutes of pure grief, ugly and unwitnessed, and hers alone. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and began to think practically about where she was going to sleep. She had $42 and a sewing kit. She had her mother's iron thimble in her coat pocket. She had the skills her mother had given her and her grandmother, before that passed down through the women of her family like a quiet inheritance, the knowledge of fabric and needle, and the patience required to make broken things whole again. She was not without resources. She was only without the life she had planned. It took her 2 weeks, 3 towns, and 1 very uncomfortable overnight coach ride to arrive in Silver Spur Junction. Silver Spur was not a destination so much as a stopping point, the kind of town that existed because it had to positioned along a route that cattle drives and supply wagons used whether they wanted to or not. Main Street was a single dirt road flanked by a handful of buildings that leaned slightly into each other as though for warmth. There was a livery stable, a saloon, a land office, a barber shop, and at the far end, occupying the largest and most solid-looking structure on the block, Dempsey's General Store. Calvin Dempsey was a narrow man in his mid-50s with quick, calculating eyes and the kind of smile that arrived on his face slightly before the warmth behind it did or would have if the warmth had ever actually been there. He was also the only person in Silver Spur Junction willing to rent space to a woman traveling alone with no husband, no brother, no letter of reference, and no explanation beyond the truth that she needed a corner and an outlet for her trade. He offered her a section in the back of the store, curtained off from the dry goods, with a length of faded muslin just wide enough for her small work table and her chair. The rent was $3 a month. She agreed before he could add conditions, because she could see in his face that conditions were forming, and she preferred to establish the transaction before they arrived. She set up her corner that same afternoon. She had her sewing kit, her thimble, a small oil lamp, and the disciplined habit of making do. By the following morning, she had tacked a handwritten card to the front of her muslin curtain, mending and alterations. Reasonable rates. Inquire within. Silver Spur Junction was not on the surface a town with a great deal of need for a seamstress. But Martha had learned long ago that the surface of a town and its actual interior were rarely the same thing. Men who would never admit to owning a garment that needed mending brought her shirts with missing buttons and trousers with blown seams, handing them over in brown paper as though they were something shameful. Women who could not afford the catalog prices for ready-made work brought her fabric and asked her to create from nothing. Cowboys fresh off the trail brought her gear that had been stitched and restitched until the original thread was only a memory, and asked her to make it hold for one more season. She charged fairly. She worked accurately. She did not make conversation unless it was invited, and she did not offer opinions unless they were requested. Within 6 weeks, she had a small but consistent stream of customers and a reputation for doing what she promised, which in Silver Spur Junction passed for extraordinary. She was also acquiring a different kind of reputation, the kind she had not asked for and could not entirely prevent. The town had eyes the way all small towns do, and those eyes noticed things. They noticed that she was large. They noticed that she was unmarried. They noticed that she seemed to belong to no one, which in 1883 was treated less as a neutral fact and more as an open question, one that everyone felt entitled to answer on her behalf. The women of Silver Spur Junction were not most of them deliberately cruel. They simply operated within a world that had very specific ideas about what a woman was supposed to look like and what a woman who did not look that way was supposed to accept about her circumstances. They were polite to Martha's face. Behind her curtain, she could occasionally hear the conversations. They did not bother to lower their voices for the comparisons made between her and farm equipment, the quiet consensus that she was to be tolerated, but not really included. She heard them. She kept her eyes on her work. Her needle moved. There was one name she heard more than once delivered in the particular tone that people use when they believe they are being clever. Walking cow. She did not react to it the first time or the 5th time. She filed it away in the same interior cabinet where she kept the note written in pencil, and she kept working. Calvin Dempsey was a different kind of problem. He had been pleasant enough in the first weeks, efficient and businesslike in the way that men can be when they are biding their time. But as autumn deepened and the days shortened and the store grew quieter, in the way that frontier towns do when winter begins to threaten, and at the edges his behavior shifted in the way she had already predicted it would. He began to linger near her curtain. He began to let his eyes rest on her in the way that was not about seeing her, but about appraising her, calculating what she might be worth to him and in what currency. He raised her rent without warning in October, citing improvements he had made to the building that Martha could not identify. She paid it. He began dropping by her corner in the evenings after the store had closed to discuss business matters that did not require discussion and could not justify the way he positioned himself between her and the only exit. She was not frightened of him precisely. She was too practically intelligent for simple fear, but she understood the geometry of her situation with the same clarity she brought to understanding a difficult pattern. She was alone. She was in a space she did not own. She was dependent on his goodwill for the roof over her head, and he was beginning to understand the leverage that gave him. She began thinking about her options in the same methodical way she approached every problem, taking inventory of what she had, what she needed, and what gap existed between the two. She had some savings now, not enough for independence, but enough to matter. She had her skills. She had her reputation, modest but real. What she did not have was a solution that did not involve either capitulating to Dempsey's unspoken demands or leaving and starting over somewhere colder and later in the year. She was still turning the problem over in her mind on the first genuinely cold night of November when the bell above the store's front door rang at 7:30 and Wyatt Cole Reddick walked in carrying a shirt that looked as though it had been used to settle a disagreement with barbed wire. She had seen him before. He came in every week or two, always late in the day, always carrying something destroyed. He was a large man himself, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point where age could be accurately guessed, and he moved with the contained, deliberate quality of someone who had learned to take up less space than his body required. He never made conversation. He left things, collected them when they were done, paid without complaint, and left. But tonight he did not simply drop the shirt on her work table and wait. He stood in the entrance of her curtained space and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. An expression that was not appraising, and not pitying, and not any of the things she had learned to brace for. He looked at her as though he was trying to figure out if she was the solution to a problem he had been working on for some time. "You got somewhere to be after winter sets in," he said. It was such a strange opening that for a moment she simply looked at him. "I'm here," she said. "Here." He glanced at the curtain at the muslin hanging between her small corner and the rest of Dempsey's store. "This is where you're planning to stay, until something changes." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were wrapped in cloth, she noticed, the right one especially bound at the wrist and palm in a way that spoke of something more than a cut. "Something's changing," he said, "for both of us. I got a proposition. It's not what you might think, so I'm asking you to hear it out before you decide." Martha set down the shirt she had been holding and gave him her full attention. She had learned a long time ago that the people who felt they needed to preface a proposal by clarifying what it was not were usually telling you the most important thing first. "I'm listening," she said. He leaned against the doorframe and told her. His ranch 4 miles out was going to lose half its herd if he could not manage both the outdoor work and the homestead through the coming winter, and his hand was injured badly enough that he could not do both alone. He needed someone to run the inside of the operation, to keep the fire going, to manage supplies, to do the 100 small things that kept a working ranch from collapsing so that he could concentrate entirely on keeping his cattle alive. He could offer her a room, a safe one. He did not elaborate on what safe meant, but his eyes moved briefly toward the front of the store, where Dempsey could sometimes be heard moving around in the evenings, and Martha understood that Wyatt Reddick was a man who noticed things even when he did not comment on them. "It is a trade," he said, "not charity. You'd work for what you get, same as you do here. Come spring, if it suits neither of us, we call it done." "You're not asking me to be anything other than what I am," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm asking you to run a household through a hard winter. That's a job, not a favor." She thought about the note written in pencil. She thought about Dempsey's footsteps in the evening and the way he stood between her and the door. She thought about what it meant to be useful rather than tolerated, to have work that was real and necessary rather than permitted. "I'll need to bring my sewing table," she said. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. "Wagon comes Tuesday," he said. "That enough time?" She looked at the work spread across her table, the mended shirts and patched trousers and let-out seams. She looked at the muslin curtain Dempsey had strung up to separate her from the rest of his store, a boundary that had always been more his than hers. "It's enough," she said. She did not tell anyone she was leaving. She did not post a notice or say goodbye to the women whose whispers she had learned to hear without listening. On Tuesday morning, she was standing outside Dempsey's store with her trunk and her sewing table when Wyatt Reddick's wagon came down the main road through the frost. He climbed down without a word, loaded her things with his good hand and his injured one, and helped her up to the bench. They drove out of Silver Spur Junction in silence, the town growing smaller behind them in the pale morning light. Martha did not look back. Not because she was being dramatic about it, but because there was genuinely nothing back there she needed to see. The road ahead was hard-packed dirt going into open country, and the sky above it was the particular hard blue of a November morning that has not decided yet what it intends to do with the rest of the day. The wind came off the plain in long, cold sweeps. Martha pulled her coat tighter and watched the horizon. She had $42 when she left Caldwell. She had considerably less now, though she had more skills and more knowledge, and a harder-edged understanding of how the world worked than she had carried with her out of that church. She had a thimble in her pocket and a destination ahead that she had not chosen so much as accepted, because accepting it was the most dignified option available. It was not the life she had planned. But she had stopped somewhere between the altar and the open road, believing that the life she had planned was necessarily the one she deserved. The ranch appeared on the horizon as a dark cluster of shapes against the brown grass. A cabin, a barn, a fence line running off into the distance. Small, sturdy, built to last rather than to impress. Wyatt glanced at her once as they turned off the road onto the property. She kept her eyes forward. Whatever this was, she intended to meet it straight on. The cabin was colder than it looked from the road. That was the first thing Martha noticed when Wyatt pushed open the front door and stepped aside to let her in. The second thing she noticed was that it was clean. Not comfortable, not arranged with any particular thought toward living in it, so much as surviving in it, but clean in the way that a man living alone and working hard will sometimes keep a space out of discipline rather than pride. There were no dishes left out. The floor had been swept recently. A single chair sat beside the cold fireplace, as though it had been placed there by someone who intended to sit in it, and then never quite found the time. Wyatt set her trunk down near the back wall and straightened up slowly, favoring his right hand. "Room's through there," he said, nodding toward a narrow door. "Small. There's a cot and a chest. The stove needs wood before dark, or the pipes freeze." He said it the way he said most things, as information rather than conversation. Martha nodded, and Ted went to look at the room. It was indeed small. The cot was narrow and the chest was scarred with use, and the single window faced north, which meant it would get no afternoon sun. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory the way she always did, not measuring what was missing, but calculating what could be done with what was there. She went back out to the main room and looked at the fireplace. "Where's the wood?" she said. He pointed toward the back door. She put her coat back on and went outside. The wood pile was substantial, but poorly organized round, stacked in a way that shed water instead of shedding it, which meant the outer layers would be wet. She found the dry wood underneath and began carrying it in armload by armload, stacking it near the hearth in a way that would let it breathe and dry properly. Wyatt watched her from the doorway of the barn for a moment and then disappeared inside without comment. She had the fire going before the last light left the sky. The first week established the rhythm of things. Wyatt rose before dawn and was outside within minutes, moving between the barn and the pasture with the focused efficiency of a man who had been working alone for long enough that he no longer wasted motion on anything. Martha rose shortly after and took the inside. She inventoried the food stores, reorganized the kitchen shelves so that the heaviest use items were closest to hand, patched the gap in the south wall where wind was pushing through between the logs, and found in the chest beneath the window a collection of curtains that had been folded away. Unused thin cotton, faded, but still intact. She hung them. It did not make the cabin warm, but it made it quieter, and quiet was its own kind of warmth. Wyatt came in for meals and ate without complaint, and went back out. They exchanged perhaps 30 words a day in those first weeks, all of them practical. She would tell him what supplies were running low. He would tell her if something in the barn needed attention. They existed in the same space with the careful courtesy of two people who understood they had made an agreement and intended to honor it. But Martha noticed things because noticing had always been one of her primary defenses against a world that preferred to look past her. She noticed that he ate everything she put in front of him, but never said so. She noticed that he came inside later and later each evening as the cold deepened, which meant he was spending more time in the barn than was strictly necessary, and that he sat beside the fire with his wrapped hand resting in his lap, and sometimes did not move for a long time, looking at nothing she could identify in the room. She noticed the particular quality of the silence that settled over him on those evenings, the way it was different from ordinary tiredness, heavier and more interior, the kind of silence that comes from somewhere a person cannot name. She did not ask about it. It was not what they had agreed to. She asked instead, on the 8th day, about his hand. They were at the table after supper, the fire well banked behind them, and she had noticed that he had been wrapping it himself that morning, which was slow and difficult, and not done well. "That dressing needs changing," she said. He looked at her. "I can see it from here," she added, which was true. The cloth was gray at the edges and beginning to stiffen. "I have clean linen in my kit. It'll take 5 minutes." He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. Then he put his hand on the table. The wound was worse than she had expected, a deep cut across the palm that had been stitched by someone who knew what they were doing, but had not had good light to do it in, and the surrounding tissue was swollen in a way that suggested the cold was slowing its healing. She cleaned it without comment, and redressed it with the neat, certain movements she used on everything that required her hands to know what they were doing before her mind had finished deliberating. When she was done, he turned his hand over, once looking at the fresh wrapping. "You're efficient," he said. "I've been told," she said, and stood to put her kit away. She was at the shelf when he spoke again quietly to the room as much as to her. "I had a hired hand through last winter. He left in February when the drifts got bad, said it wasn't worth the wage." She did not turn around. "Did you find it difficult finishing alone?" A pause. "I lost 11 head. She put her kit down and turned then, because 11 head was not an incidental number for a ranch this size. It was the kind of loss that left marks on a man's ledger and his confidence in equal measure. "That won't happen this winter," she said. It was not a reassurance. She said it the same way she would have said that the woodpile was stacked properly now, or that the south wall was sealed. It was a statement of intended fact. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite classify. Then he nodded once, and that was all, but it was something. The cold that came in December was serious. It moved in over 3 days, dropping the temperature from merely bitter to something with genuine intent behind it, the kind of cold that found the weaknesses in a structure and pressed on them until something gave. Martha found 3 new gaps in the cabin walls by the simple method of holding a candle near the baseboards and watching the flame. She sealed them with strips of canvas soaked in lard, which was not pretty, but was effective, and she draped the thinnest of the curtains along the base of the outside door where the draft was worst. Wyatt came in one afternoon to find the cabin warmer than it had been since October, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment as though recalibrating his understanding of the space. "The lard will hold through January," she said from her sewing table where she was repairing a canvas feed bag. "After that, it may need redoing." He looked at the sealed baseboards, then at her, then back at the baseboards. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My mother's house leaked," she said. "She had 5 children and 1 income. You learn what you need to." He was quiet again, but this time the quality of it was different, not the heavy interior silence of those fireside evenings, but the more ordinary quiet of a man who has been given something to think about. He went back outside. 20 minutes later, she heard something unexpected from the direction of the barn, the sound of an axe working steadily, which was unusual because the afternoon's primary task had been mending fence line on the east pasture. When he came back in before supper, he set something on her work table without comment and went to wash up. She looked down. Her sewing shears. The ones she had been using, despite the fact that they had been pulling rather than cutting for the past 2 weeks, the blades gone slightly dull in the way that scissors go dull gradually enough that you stop noticing until something reminds you of what sharp feels like. He had sharpened them, both blades properly, at the correct angle, and wiped them clean afterward. She picked them up and made a single cut through a scrap of muslin she kept for testing. The fabric parted like water. She set them down carefully. Something had shifted quietly and without announcement in the economy of their arrangement. They were still operating within the terms of their agreement, but the terms had begun to include things that had not been written down. Small recognitions, small attentions, the kind that accumulate like interest and eventually become something that has to be acknowledged. She did not say anything about the shears that evening. But 2 days later, when she noticed that the single chair he used at the fireside had a back leg that was slowly separating from the frame, working its way loose, the way old joinery does when a house flexes with the cold, she did not simply note it and move on. She found his toolbox under the bench by the door and fixed it herself, working carefully so as not to damage the existing wood, cleaning up the sawdust before he came in. He sat down that evening and shifted his weight, the way you do when you are used to compensating for a thing that is no longer there to compensate for. He glanced down at the leg, then across the room at her. She was looking at her work. He looked back at the fire. Neither of them said anything, but the silence between them had changed its character. It was no longer simply the absence of conversation. It had become something with texture and weight, the kind of silence that 2 people build together over time that belongs to them specifically and could not be replicated with anyone else. Then the second week of December brought Dempsey. He came out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to collect an outstanding balance on a store account that Wyatt had paid 3 weeks prior. Martha knew he had paid it because she had been the one to log the payment in the household ledger she had set up in her first week. Dempsey knew it too. His eyes went to her the moment she opened the cabin door and did not move back to Wyatt, who appeared behind her shoulder when the man came in from the barn. "Just a clerical matter," Dempsey said, smiling his arriving smile. "Happy to sort it out." Martha set the ledger on the table open to the correct page and said nothing. Dempsey looked at the entry. Then he looked at her again, and the calculation in his eyes was very clear to anyone who knew how to read it. He had come out here to see what the situation was, to assess whether the arrangement between Martha and Wyatt Reddick was one that he might still have some leverage over, or whether that leverage had passed entirely out of his hands. He looked at the cabin, at the sealed walls and the hung curtains and the stacked wood by the hearth. He looked at the ledger in Martha's handwriting. He looked at Wyatt, who was standing very still near the door with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that was not unfriendly, but was entirely flat. "Right," Dempsey said. "Must have been a posting error on our end. I apologize for the trouble." He left before the coffee was ready. Wyatt watched the wagon go down the road and then came back inside and looked at the ledger still open on the table. "You set that up yourself," he said. "First week," she said. He turned a few pages looking at the entries. Every supply run logged, every expense noted, the winter stores inventoried with the current levels and the projected needs written beside them in 2 different columns. He closed it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "I'll be in the barn," he said, which was what he always said. But before he went through the door, he stopped with his back to her and added something he had not said before. "You did good work here, Martha." She heard the door close behind him. She stood in the middle of the room with the fire going and the sealed walls holding the warmth in and the sharpened shears on her work table, catching the light. The winter was still young. The hardest months were still ahead. But for the first time since she had walked back down that church aisle in her hand-sewn dress, she felt something that was not defiance or endurance or the grim satisfaction of survival. She felt quietly and without ceremony that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. January came in like a verdict. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in a single night, and Martha woke to find ice on the inside of the north window, a thin crystalline sheet that had formed while they slept delicate and absolute. She broke it with her knuckle, dressed quickly in the dark, and had the fire rebuilt before Wyatt's boots hit the floor in the main room. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the flames already going, though the kettle already on. He did not say anything, but he looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the particular way a person looks at something they did not expect to rely on and have found, against their own predictions, that they do. Then he pulled on his coat and went out into the dark and the cold, and Martha began the day. January was where the real work lived. Not the mending and organizing of the early weeks, the preparation, but the daily labor of keeping a ranch alive when the world outside was actively trying to kill it. Martha chopped wood every morning until her shoulders burned, learning the angle of the axe against the grain, learning which rounds would split clean and which would require 3 strikes and a wedge. She discovered that her size, which she had spent most of her life being told was a deficiency, was in fact a form of capital in this context. She could carry more in a single trip than most men managed in 2. She could brace a fence post while Wyatt hammered without being moved by the impact. She could work longer in the cold before her core temperature dropped to the point of diminishing returns her body's mass, holding warmth the way a stone holds heat long after the fire is gone. The cattle needed supplemental feed twice a day when the grass was buried. Martha took one of the 2 daily runs so Wyatt could spend more time checking the fence line for storm damage. She learned which animals were prone to injury, which ones wandered toward the drifts and needed to be pushed back, which cow had a front knee that swelled in the worst cold and needed to be watched. She learned the ranch the way she had always learned things, by paying attention, by being present and methodical, by treating information as something worth collecting regardless of whether she had been formally invited to possess it. One afternoon in the 3rd week of January, she came in from the feed run to find Wyatt in the barn not working, standing beside his horse with one hand on the animal's neck and his eyes somewhere that was not the barn. His right hand was unwrapped, which she had told him not to do in the cold. He did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. This was the thing she had noticed and not addressed, not the hand. The other thing, the way he disappeared sometimes without leaving, going somewhere inside himself, that had a landscape she could not see but could feel in the air around him. It happened most at night, and she had grown accustomed to lying in her cot, listening to the quality of the silence in the main room, change in the small hours, sometimes hearing him rise and go to sit by the fire, Not moving, not doing anything, just sitting with whatever it was that had followed him to this ranch and showed no intention of leaving. "Your hand," she said from the doorway. He came back into the room. He looked at his bare hand as though he had forgotten it was there. "Come inside when you're done," she said. "I'll rewrap it." She went in and got her kit and waited. He came in 10 minutes later and sat at the table, and put his hand out without being asked. She worked in silence for a moment, and then, because she had decided somewhere in the past few weeks that honesty served both of them better than courtesy, she said it. "You don't sleep." A pause. "I sleep enough." "You're at the fire most nights by 2 in the morning. I hear you." He was quiet for a moment. "Sorry if I wake you," he said. "You don't wake me." She tied off the wrapping. "I notice when the quality of the silence changes. It's a different thing." He looked at her then, and she held the look without moving. "It's an old habit," he said finally. "The nights. It doesn't affect the work. I know it doesn't." She put her kit away. "I'm not asking because of the work." That was as far as she pushed it, because she understood from long experience that there are things a person can only be led to the door of, never through it. But she had said enough to let him know the door existed, and that she was not afraid to stand near it. He did not sleep better that night as far as she could tell, but he did not move to the fire either. He lay still in the dark, which was perhaps its own kind of acknowledgment. February arrived, and with it a blizzard that lasted 3 days. On the second day, when the drifts had reached the level of the barn door, and Wyatt was trying to dig a path through to reach the cattle, the handle of the main shovel snapped clean at the neck, leaving them with 2 inadequate spades and more snow than either of them had planned for. Martha went into the barn storage and found a length of hardwood she had noted in the first week while taking inventory, seasoned and straight. She spent 40 minutes in the cold barn fashioning a replacement handle with Wyatt's draw knife and her own careful hands, fitting it into the socket and binding it at the neck with wet rawhide that she knew would tighten as it dried and hold better than nails. Wyatt tested it against a drift, leaned into it with his full weight. It held. He looked at her over his shoulder. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It was the same question he had asked about the large sealed walls. "I learned it just now," she said, "but I've been good with my hands my whole life. The application changes. The principle doesn't." He turned back to the digging, and she picked up one of the spades and worked beside him, and they did not speak again for 2 hours, because there was too much work to be done for conversation. But working beside someone in silence is its own form of communication, and by the time they had dug through to the cattle, they had communicated something that neither of them had words for yet. That evening, with the blizzard still pressing against the walls and the fire built high, Wyatt brought something out from the chest near the back wall and set it on the floor of the main room. It took Martha a moment to recognize what she was looking at. He had cut the wood himself, a large solid rectangle of oak, from a downed tree at the edge of his property, planed smooth and squared at the corners and fitted with legs that were solid enough to bear real weight. He had been working on it in the barn, she realized. On the evenings she had thought he was simply doing late chores. It was a sewing table, better than the one she had brought from Silver Spur Junction. Better by a considerable measure, built to the height and depth she would need for serious work rather than the shallow surface of a store corner. She stood looking at it for a long moment. "The other one lists to the left," he said. "I noticed." She had noticed too. She had been compensating for it for weeks with a folded piece of canvas under the short leg. "You made this in the barn," she said. "Evenings." She thought about those evenings. Him in the barn in the cold, working on something for her, while she lay in her cot, listening to the blizzard. She thought about the sharpened shears and the fixed chair, and the way he had loaded her things onto the wagon without being asked with a wrapped hand, because she had said she needed to bring her table, and he had taken that seriously. She put her hand on the surface of the new table. The wood was smooth. He had sanded it carefully, which would have taken time, which meant he had valued the result enough to take the time. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "It's a fair trade," he said. "You sealed the walls." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, or appearing to look at the table, and she understood suddenly that he was as uncomfortable with receiving acknowledgement as she was that they were both people who had learned to express care through action rather than declaration, because declaration had proved unreliable, and that this was perhaps the most significant thing they had in common. She moved her work to the new table that evening, spreading out the pieces she was repairing and arranging her kit the way she preferred it, and the list in the old table stopped mattering. The blizzard broke on the third day and left behind a landscape so clean and absolute it was almost violent. The snow had erased every boundary and softened every edge, and the whole world outside was white and utterly still. The night terrors came that same night. She heard him before she was fully awake, a sound, not quite a shout, cut off before it became one followed by the particular quality of silence that comes immediately after a person wakes and spends a fraction of a second not knowing where they are. She lay still for a moment listening. She heard him breathe, controlled and deliberate, the way someone breathes when they are telling their own body to stand down. She got up. He was sitting on the edge of his cot when she came to his doorway, elbows on his knees, head down. The room was cold. He had not lit the lamp. "Don't is," he said without looking up. "I'm all right." "I know," she said. She did not move to comfort him or ask questions. She simply stood in the doorway, a solid and unhurried presence in the dark, the way you might stand near an animal that has been frightened, not reaching, not retreating, just being there, and letting the there-ness be enough. After a long moment, he said very quietly, "There was a boy." She waited. "My brother." He was 19. She said nothing because nothing was what was needed. "He died because of a choice I made." The words came out flat and measured the way words come out when a person has been carrying them so long they have worn the edges smooth. "I believed I was doing the right thing. He believed in me. Those two things destroyed him." The wind moved against the cabin walls. The fire in the main room gave its low sound. "I've spent 6 years waiting to deserve something," he said. "A decent winter, a holding ranch, anything that doesn't turn to ash." He stopped. Martha stood in the doorway in the dark and did not offer him absolution because she had none to give and he would not have wanted it. She did not tell him he was forgiven or that it was not his fault or any of the other things that people say when they cannot bear the weight of someone else's grief. She stayed where she was and let him be what he was, which was a man in the dark with a real wound, not a metaphorical one. "You have a decent winter," she said finally. "You've kept your herd. Your walls are sealed. Your house is warm." She paused. "That's not ash." He raised his head and looked at her across the dark room. She went back to her cot. She lay down and listened to the wind, and after a while she heard him lie back down too. And later, quite a lot later, she heard his breathing change into something slower and more even. He slept until morning. It was the first time to her knowledge that he had done that. When she came out at dawn to rebuild the fire, she found that he had already done it. The kettle was on. 2 cups were set out on the table, which he had never done before. She sat down in her chair and looked at the cups for a moment. Outside, the snow-covered range stretched all the way to the horizon, and somewhere in the middle distance his cattle moved slowly through the white. Alive, and accounted for every last one. She poured her coffee and started the day. The 2 cups became a habit without either of them deciding it would. Wyatt was up first more often now, and when Martha came out in the early dark, the coffee was already made, and her cup was already set. And she would sit, and he would come in from his first barn check and sit across from her and they would drink together in the particular silence that had become theirs, the one with texture and weight, the one that required no performance from either of them. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. March announced itself with a week of false warmth that melted the top layer of snow and turned the ranch road into a slow river of mud, and then pulled the warmth back like a hand withdrawing a gift. Dropping the temperature again hard enough that the mud froze overnight with boot prints and wheel ruts locked inside it, a record of every passing preserved until the real thaw came. Martha found it oddly beautiful. The evidence of days captured in ice. The herd had come through, all of them. Every animal that had been alive in November was alive now, and the ones she had watched most closely, the cow with the swollen knee, the young steer that had wandered toward the eastern drift twice in January, were moving through the half-thawed pasture with the easy indifference of creatures who had never doubted their own survival. Wyatt stood at the fence line one afternoon and counted them the way she had seen him count them every day, methodically touching each number with his eyes as though confirming a fact he needed to be certain of. "All of them," she said from beside him. "All of them," he said. He said it with a quietness that she understood was not simple satisfaction. He was a man who had lost 11 animals the previous winter, who had spent 6 years believing that the things he cared for had a tendency to be destroyed by their proximity to him. 43 living cattle in a March pasture was not for Wyatt Reddick merely a successful season. She did not remark on this. She understood it. What she did not understand and had not yet found the language for was the change that had been occurring in her own interior landscape with the same gradual certainty as the seasonal shift outside. She had come to this ranch for survival. She had stayed for the same reason. But somewhere in the long middle of winter, between the sealed walls and the sharpened shears and the dark doorway where she had stood while he spoke his brother's name, she had stopped simply surviving the arrangement and had begun to inhabit it. To inhabit him in the way that two people who share a genuine life inevitably begin to carry pieces of each other. She was still thinking about this carefully and without conclusion. On the afternoon, the stranger's horse appeared at the end of the road. She saw it from the kitchen window. A gray horse moving at a deliberate walk, carrying a rider who sat too loosely in the saddle for someone simply passing through. There was something studied about the casualness, something that her instincts, sharpened by months of paying close attention to everything, identified immediately as performance. She went to the door. The rider was a man in his 40s, lean-faced with pale eyes that moved across the property in a single practiced sweep before settling on her. He had a beard grown past the point of intention, and his coat was good quality and badly cared for, which told her something. "Afternoon," he said. "Looking for Reddick, Wyatt Reddick." "He's working," she said. "That's so." The pale eyes moved over her with the same sweep they had given the property. "You his wife?" She did not hesitate. "Yes." Something passed across the man's face. Not surprise. More like an adjustment, a recalculation of a sum that had not come out the way he expected. "Tell him Cole Maddox sends his regards," the man said. "Tell him Cole says hello from all the old friends." He turned the horse and rode back down the road at the same deliberate walk. Martha stood in the doorway until he was out of sight. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the east pasture restringing a section of fence that the last freeze had buckled. She walked out across the half-frozen ground, and when he looked up and saw her face, he straightened immediately, the wire still in his hands. She told him what had happened. She told him exactly what the man had looked like and exactly what he had said in the order he had said it, without editorializing. She had always understood that precision was more useful than interpretation. She watched Wyatt's face as she spoke. She had become fluent in his expressions, over the winter could read the small ones that he did not know he was making. What she saw now was not surprise. It was the particular tightening of a man who has been expecting something and finds when it finally arrives that the anticipation was not sufficient preparation. He set the wire down. "Come inside," he said. He told her at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes level in the same flat, careful voice he had used to speak his brother's name in the dark of his room. He told her about the years before Silver Spur Junction, before the ranch, before the solitary, deliberate life he had been building like a structure he intended to be difficult to breach. He told her about the men he had ridden with, about the point at which riding with them had stopped being a matter of survival and had become something he could no longer name without revulsion. He told her about the choice he had made. The sheriff he had contacted the plan that was supposed to prevent bloodshed and had instead redirected it. He told her about his brother. Not the way he had told it in the dark in February, in fragments in the voice of a man speaking under pressure. This time he told it straight through, beginning to end with the specific details that he had clearly been carrying in a specific order for 6 years. The name of the town, the name of the sheriff, the time of day. The fact that his brother had been on the wrong side of a doorway when the shooting started, and that Wyatt had not known he was there, and that not knowing had not in any way that mattered to him reduced the weight of what happened. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "The men who came after me before," he said. "I managed alone, moved on, changed towns. But they stopped for a while, and I thought." He stopped. I let myself think it was over. "Cole Maddox, she said. Is he the one who leads them? What's left of them? 3, maybe 4 men. Maddox is not stupid. He's patient." Wyatt looked at his hands on the table. "He doesn't just want me dead. He wants me to know I brought it on everyone around me. He thinks it's justice." Martha looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to send you to town." She had known it was coming. She had known it from the moment she saw his face in the east pasture, before she even finished telling him what the man had said. She had recognized the shape of what he was going to decide, because she had seen this particular decision before, not from him, but from every person who had ever believed that the correct way to protect someone was to remove them from the equation. "No," she said. He looked up. "You need to think about this carefully," he said in the tone of a man who believes he is being reasonable. "I am thinking about it carefully. My answer is no." "Martha." He said her name with a weight she was not accustomed to hearing from him. "These are not reasonable men. Maddox will use you. He'll do it without hesitation because he knows it works. He's done it before. I understand that." "Then you understand why you need to leave." She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the pasture, at the cattle, moving in the thin March light, at the fence line they had repaired together, at the road that ran out toward Silver Spur Junction and the wider world beyond it. She looked at all of it for a moment. Then she turned around. "When I came here," she said, "you told me it was a trade, that you needed someone to run this house so you could keep your herd alive. You said it was a contract." "That was different." "How?" "The winter was dangerous. The cold could have killed the cattle. You didn't ask me to leave when the blizzard hit. A blizzard is not men with guns who know how to hurt people." "No, Bo," she said, "it isn't. But I didn't come here because I believed nothing bad would ever happen. I came because this was the most honest arrangement anyone had ever offered me. And I intend to honor it." He stood up then, and the table between them suddenly felt less like furniture and more like a boundary being tested. "I am trying to protect you," he said. "I know." Her voice was steady. "And I am telling you that I don't need protection from this. I need you to trust me in this the way you trusted me with the woodpile and the walls, and the winter stores, and your brother's name." That stopped him. She watched it, stop him, watch the argument he had been building collapse at its foundation. "You cannot ask me to stand aside while someone uses you as a weapon against me," he said, and his voice had changed, stripped of its reasoning. This was not strategy. This was something more, exposed. "I am not asking you to stand aside," she said. "I am asking you to stop standing alone." The silence that followed was different from any silence they had built together. It was the kind that comes after something irreversible has been said, not destructive, but permanent. The kind that marks a before and an after. He crossed to the window where she was standing and stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of what was in his face. Not calculation now, not strategy, not the managed expression of a man keeping his own counsel. Just the face of someone who had been alone with something crushing for a very long time and had just been told in plain language that he did not have to be. "They'll come at night," he said quietly. "Maddox always comes at night." "Then we'll be ready at night," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, a wind came off the plain and moved through the dead grass at the edge of the property, a low sound not threatening, just present. The fire in the hearth gave it steady light. The cabin was warm, the walls held. "I'll check the rifle," he said finally. "I'll check the stores," she said. "We'll need to know what we have." He nodded once and moved toward the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and stood there for a moment without speaking, his back to her, the late afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that made the room look like something painted rather than lived in. "Martha," he said. "Yes." A pause. Long enough that she wondered if he would say what he was reaching for, or pull back from it the way he had pulled back from difficult things before. "I'm glad you came to the ranch," he said. She held that for a moment. She thought about the altar in Caldwell, the note in pencil, the $42 and the long coach ride, and the dimly lit corner of Dempsey's store. She thought about all the distances she had traveled, literal and otherwise, to arrive at this specific kitchen, in this specific March light standing beside a window she had hung curtains on in November. "So am I," she said. He went out to check the rifle. She went to take inventory of the stores. They worked until dark separately and with purpose, and when they came together again, at the table for the evening meal, the two cups were set out as they always were, and they ate in the particular silence that was theirs, and did not speak about what was coming, because they had already said everything that needed to be said. But Maddox did not come that night, or the next. The waiting was its own kind of pressure, slow and accumulative, the way cold is more dangerous when it builds gradually than when it arrives all at once. 3 days passed, then 4. Wyatt rode the perimeter each morning and found nothing, no tracks. No signs of camp, no indication of watchers in the tree line to the north. The ranch was quiet. The cattle grazed. The mud on the road slowly dried as March pushed forward, and life on the property continued in its outward form exactly as it had before. But the quality of every ordinary moment had changed. Martha felt it in the way she moved through the cabin, now noting the sightlines from each window, knowing where the shadows fell after dark. She felt it in the way Wyatt positioned himself each evening, his chair angled toward the door. They had not spoken about any of this explicitly. They had simply both begun doing it, to reading each other's adjustments and mirroring them, two people who had learned each other well enough to move in the same direction without being told. On the 5th night, she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of Wyatt's chair scraping back from the table. She lay still for a moment listening, but it was not the fire he was going to. He was moving toward the window. She was up before he reached it. There were 4 of them. Wyatt counted the shapes moving through the north tree line before Martha reached the window, his hand already on her arm, pulling her below the sill, the two of them crouching in the dark with the firelight behind them low enough not to throw shadow through the glass. "Maddox," he said, quiet, certain. How many were? 4, maybe a 5th holding the horses further back. He was already moving, keeping low to where the rifle leaned against the wall beside the door. "Get to the root cellar. The door is behind the kitchen shelf. Pull the shelf and go down. There is a latch on the inside." She did not move. "Martha." "I heard you the first time," she said. She was at her own corner of the window, looking at the tree line. The shapes had stopped moving. They were waiting for something, probably for the fire to die completely, for the cabin to go fully dark. "They're not rushing. They want you awake for this. That's why you need to go below." She turned and looked at him in the low firelight. She had her coat on. She had put it on before she crossed the room, which meant she had known when she rose from her cot that going back to sleep was not among the available options. Her face was calm in the way it was always calm, not the absence of feeling, but the deliberate management of it channeled into attention and purpose. "Give me the shotgun," she said. "No." "Wyatt, you have one good hand and 4 men outside. Give me the shotgun." He looked at her. She watched him calculate it, the way she had seen him calculate every hard problem this winter, taking inventory of what he had and what he needed and the distance between the two. She watched him arrive at the answer he did not want. He crossed to the chest and took out the shotgun and held it for a moment with his jaw set. Then he held it out to her. She took it. It was heavier than she had expected, a doubled weight, solid and absolute. She had fired a gun before her father's old hunting rifle years ago, but this was different in her hands. She checked the breech the way her father had shown her, confirmed both chambers, closed it. "You know how to use that," Wyatt said. It was not quite a question. "I know the principle," she said. "The application changes. The principle doesn't." He looked at her for one long moment, and something in his face shifted into a region she had not seen before, past strategy, past calculation, into something unguarded and fierce and specific to her. Then the first window broke. It was the north-facing window, the one in Martha's room, the one that got no afternoon sun. The sound of breaking glass was followed immediately by the thud of something landing on the floor inside, and then the smell reached them, oil and char, a torch thrown into the room to catch the bedding and the wooden chest and the curtains she had hung in November. Wyatt moved toward the back room and Martha caught his arm. "The shelf is stone behind it," she said. "It won't carry to the main room quickly. They want you outside. That's why they used her room and not the kitchen wall." She looked at him. "Don't go where they're pointing you." He stopped, looked at her, looked at the smoke beginning to curl under the back room door. "The front," he said. "The front," she agreed. He went to the left side of the door, and she went to the right, and he pulled it open, and they came out into the cold March night, with the stars overhead and the tree line dark, and the smell of wood smoke beginning to reach even the open air. The first shot came from the left, from the shadow of the barn, and it hit the doorframe above Wyatt's head. He returned fire, one clean shot toward the muzzle flash, and the shadow dropped. Martha swung toward movement on the right, a figure coming fast from around the corner of the fence line, and she raised the shotgun to her shoulder and braced it the way her father had shown her, using the broadness of her shoulder and the solidity of her stance. Every pound of her dismissed and mocked body becoming architecture in that moment, a foundation that did not move. She fired the warning shot into the ground 6 feet in front of the figure. He stopped. From behind her she heard Wyatt's rifle again, and the sound of someone in the tree line going down. Then silence sudden and pressurized, the kind that comes when men who trade in violence recalculate the odds. A voice came out of the darkness from the direction of the barn. It was calm, almost conversational, the voice of a man who had practiced this particular tone for years. "You always did have a talent for complicating things, Wyatt." Maddox. She had not seen him yet. He had not been one of the shapes in the tree line, which meant he had been positioned elsewhere somewhere that gave him a view of the whole property, while other men absorbed the first exchange. She filed this information immediately. Wyatt said nothing. "Boy's been dead 6 years," Maddox continued still from the shadow. 6 years you been out here playing rancher and sleeping through the nights like you didn't cause it. Like the rest of us, don't carry what happened. You think running makes a man clean." "I wasn't running," Wyatt said. His voice was level. "I was building something. You were hiding." "No." He paused, and in the pause, Martha heard something settle in him, something that had been braced against itself for a long time, and had finally found a surface steady enough to rest on. "I was waiting to deserve it. I think I finally do." Maddox came out of the shadow near the barn wall. He was a tall man, angular, and he held his gun at his side rather than raise the gesture of a man who believed he was still in control of the timing of events. His pale-eyed rider from the road was not visible. 2 men were down. One was still somewhere in the tree line. The numbers had shifted considerably from what they had been 10 minutes ago. He looked at Martha, not with surprise, with the particular cold assessment of someone identifying a variable he had underestimated. "Step away from him," Maddox said to her. "This isn't your business." Martha looked at him down the barrel of the shotgun. Her hands were not steady. She was aware of this, and she did not pretend otherwise, because steadiness was not the point. The point was the second chamber still loaded, and the fact that she was not moving, and the distance between where she stood and where Wyatt stood, which was no distance at all. She was in front of him. She had moved there without deciding to the way the body sometimes executes the correct action before the mind has finished debating it. "He is my husband," she said. "You will have to go through me." Maddox looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching, because she had survived worse scrutiny than this had survived a church full of people watching her walk away from the life she had planned had survived. A town that called her names had survived a winter that would have broken people with half her resolve. A man standing in a dark yard with a gun could not construct a gaze that cut deeper than the ones she had already walked through. He raised his weapon, and then the sound came from the road. Horses. Several. Moving fast. The jangle of tack and the low call of voices, and then from the direction of Silver Spur Junction, the unmistakable rhythm of a group of riders covering ground with purpose. Someone had heard the gunfire. The shots that had seemed in the compressed intensity of the last 5 minutes like a private matter had carried across the flat open range to the town and been answered. Maddox heard it. She watched him hear it, watched the calculation in his face run its numbers and arrive at a deficit. He looked at her once more. She did not lower the shotgun. He lowered his. He backed toward the far edge of the property, slowly the way a man retreats when he is choosing to preserve himself, rather than concede, maintaining the posture of someone who has decided to leave rather than someone who has been made to. She let him go. The shotgun stayed up until he was past the tree line, until the sound of his horse leaving was clear and going the opposite direction from the approaching riders. Then her arms came down. The riders came through the gate, 6 of them from town, led by the farrier, whose shop sat at the north end of Main Street, and who had apparently roused whoever was nearby when the shots woke him. They took in the scene quickly, the broken window, the smoke still threading from the back of the cabin, the 2 figures standing in the yard, one of them holding a shotgun and breathing hard. The farrier looked at Martha. He looked at the shotgun. He looked at Wyatt, who was bleeding from a cut on his forearm that she had not noticed until now, a graze, not deep, but running red against his sleeve. "Anyone else on the property?" the farrier said. "1 in the tree line north side," Wyatt said. 2 at the barn. They're down." The riders split without further instruction to check each position. Martha set the shotgun down against the cabin wall and went to Wyatt and took his arm in her hands, turning it toward the light from the open door to see the wound. "Sit down," she said. "I'm all right." "Sit down anyway," she said, and her voice came out with something in it she had not intended, not command, but a kind of raw insistence, the voice of someone who has just been very afraid and is now on the other side of it, and needs a moment to confirm that the person beside her is still whole. He sat down on the cabin step. She went inside and got her kit. The back room smelled of char, and the bedding was ruined, but the fire had not spread to the main room. The stone wall she had mentioned had held, and the new sewing table was intact. She took her kit to the step and worked on his arm in the cold open air, with the riders moving around the property and the stars still overhead and the horses stamping on the frozen ground. He let her work. When she was done, she sat on the step beside him close enough that their shoulders were touching, and they stayed that way for a while without speaking. The farrier came back and stood before them and looked at Martha with an expression she did not recognize at first, because she had not seen it directed at her before. Not pity, not tolerance, something closer to respect, unvarnished and straightforward. "You held the property," he said. "We held it," she said. He nodded, accepting the correction, and went to confer with the other riders. She felt Wyatt shift beside her on the step, and then his good hand came up, and he put it carefully against the side of her face, turning her toward him with a gentleness that was so at odds with the last hour that it took her a moment to let it land. His thumb moved once against her cheek. His eyes were wet, which she suspected he was aware of, and had decided for once not to manage. "You stepped in front of me," he said. The words came out unsteady. "Yes," she said. "You could have stayed inside. You could have gone to the cellar." "I could have left in November," she said. "I could have taken the money and stayed in Caldwell and married someone who thought I was worth the trouble. I could have done a great many things." She held his gaze. "I don't want the version of this life where I go to the cellar." He made a sound that was not quite a word, and pulled her into him, his arm across her back, his face against her hair, and she felt the full weight of what he had been carrying release itself in that embrace. Not all at once, because some things do not release all at once, but enough that she could feel the difference. Enough that she could feel him under the grief and the guilt and the 6 years of punishing solitude come forward into the present tense. She put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat fast, still but slowing. Outside the broken window, the sky was beginning to change. Not yet dawn, but the particular deep blue that comes before it, the hour when the dark admits that it will not last. The riders had found what they needed to find, and were conferring quietly at the edge of the yard, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a bird had begun its first uncertain notes. The back room would need repair, the window would need glass, she would need a new cot, and the bedding would have to be replaced, and the smoke smell would linger for weeks in the curtains. She knew already how to begin. She had always known how to begin. It was the other part, the staying, the trusting, that what she built would not be taken, that had taken her longer. It had taken a winter and a contract of survival, and a man who had expressed his care in sharpened shears and an oak sewing table until he could find the words for it. It had taken standing in a dark doorway and a second cup set out on a table, and a note written in pencil that she had never needed to read again, because what it had sent her toward turned out to matter considerably more than what it had taken from her. Wyatt pulled back and looked at her face in the pre-dawn light, and she let him look the full face and the broad features and the plainness she had long since stopped apologizing for, because there was no apology in his gaze. There was only someone looking at something he could not believe he was allowed to have, and had decided at some cost, and after a great deal of evidence, that he deserved. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said, "and the most beautiful, and I am asking you right now if you will stay." She thought about what she would tell her mother if her mother were alive to ask. She thought about what she would tell the girl she had been in that Kansas church, the one who had walked out into the flat prairie road with $42 and a thimble and no destination that was not simply away. She would tell her that away was not the same as lost. She would tell her that the life worth having rarely looks like the life you planned, and that the measure of a woman is not what she is given, but what she builds with what she has, and that strength is not a liability, not in the places that matter. "I already stayed," she said. "I stayed through the worst of the winter. I stayed last night." "I know," he said. "That means yes," she said. He kissed her then. Not the way people kiss in the stories that are told about love, not perfectly or dramatically, but the way two people kiss when they have earned each other through ordinary difficulty and extraordinary honesty, fully and without reservation. The sun came up over the eastern range and laid its long light across the snow-edged pasture and the standing cabin and the fence line they had repaired together, and the cattle moved through the early gold as they always did, unhurried and alive, every last one of them. Martha sat on the step of the house she had made warm and looked at the morning, and the morning was enough, and it was hers.